Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's learning webinar. My name is Chantel, and I'm going to be your host today as we look at rendering and VR and all the options that are available so you get a really nice high-end looking webinar rendering at the end of this and understand how you can create all of the different VR options that you have in the software as well. Once we're done the formal portion of the presentation, I'm going to open up the chat panel. So you can type in any questions you might have about rendering or VR, and I'll be able to answer those live for you during this broadcast. So during the broadcast, feel free to go up there and type in any questions that you have. And then once I'm done the learning part, I'll go up there and answer them for you. So let's get started. As you can see, I have a model already done on the screen, just a simple kitchen layout. What we want to look at today is when we go to create a rendering of this space or any other space, what do we need to know about the materials in the room, the lighting in the room, and all the various settings so that we can create a really nice looking rendering. The first thing I want to look at are the materials in the room. Every material in this room, from the hardwood flooring to the marble countertops to the paint, all of those materials have settings behind them so they can look more natural when you create a rendering. I'm going to go up to the top of the screen and click on the tool, the material paintbrush. When I click on this material paintbrush, you'll notice the catalog panel to the right-hand side of the screen will display all the various materials that are available. I want to find out what material I'm looking at specifically with that countertop. So underneath the materials options here, you'll see that there's an eyedropper. I'm going to click on that eyedropper and then take a sample of that material. When I do, the material is highlighted here in our list of materials. So I can see that that's using countertop number 25. I want to look at all the different settings that are set for that countertop. So I'm going to right click on that option in the materials and edit the material. That brings up its material properties. Every material in Envisioneer has material properties behind it. When we're looking at the materials itself, you can see that this countertop number 25 is actually a texture that we brought in. It's a JPEG, quartz number 17. So when it looks at this JPEG that we brought in, when it goes to put it on top of the countertop and the backsplash, it just takes that little square of quartz and keeps repeating it along the surface. So if you're ever bringing in your own materials, make sure it's a nice, clean picture of that material itself. You want to make sure there's no shades or shadows on it or extra pieces of material in it. Just simply the material because it's going to repeat it. At the very bottom of this dialog box, we see the rendering effects, and that's what we really want to highlight today and look at. So when I'm looking at the rendering effects, I'm going to click on this little option here to display the settings. This countertop 25 can have settings dealing with specular, emissive, and transparency. When we're dealing with specular, think of glossy. The higher the percentage of specular, the more glossy, more liquid that material is going to look. So if you want that material to have a sheen to it, then you're going to bump up the specular value. As a tip, I would never have a texture above 15%. If it gets above 15%, it really looks liquidy. So you might want to reserve that for any kind of water textures that you have in a scene. But any materials like this marble countertop, if you wanted it to be shiny, or the hardwood floors, if you wanted to give them a sheen, this is the value that you're going to pump up, the specular value. But again, never go over 15%. And when you are adding in specular properties to various materials in your scene, never give too many of them that glossy look. People tend to want to give everything that glossy look so it looks clean. But when you do that, because it's got that glossy look, it's going to be reflective, you'll have all of these various materials in your scene reflecting off of each other. And again, it starts to get that liquid look that looks unrealistic. So I always find one element in my scene that I want to be that 15%, that I want to be glossy to really kind of stand out in the scene. And everything else I kind of pale off on that and making them maybe 5%. Not as glossy so that the attention of the eye goes to that one glossy specular item in the space. Down below that option, we have emissive. Emissive properties allows that material to emit light. So think of a lampshade. You've got a material around that lampshade. You want it to give the appearance that that lampshade is illuminating. So give the material around that light an emissive property, and it will look like it's glowing. I also do that for fireplaces. So I'll take the material that's in front of the fireplace, whether it's a picture of logs that are on fire or a piece of glass, and I'll give it that emissive property of about 20%. So it's emitting light. So it looks like that fireplace is glowing or those lampshades are glowing. So that's emissive if you want to give something an emissive property. The last option is transparency. Obviously, if it's 100% transparent, then you can see right through it, like our window glass. If it's 0%, it's going to be like all of our other materials where you can't see them through them at all. But if you have something like glass block or a fogged look of your glass, you might want to give them a lesser transparency than the 100%, so you can slightly see through them, but not quite. So when you're looking at a room, think about all of the textures that are in that room and how they appear naturally if you walked into that actual room. Does the countertop have a slight gloss to it? Make sure you change the specular value. Does the light shade look like it's illuminated? Give it an emissive value. Is it glass? Make it transparent. Once you start playing with these values, you'll find that your renderings look better and better as you do. All of the materials in the default CADSoft catalog that comes with the software have settings set to them so that you should have good qualities to them. But play with those values. The more you start to play with these and do some renderings, the more you'll learn about the effects that they have. Bring something up to 30% specular. See how watery that looks. Then bring it back down to 5%. Play with those values so you can see the effects they're going to have and maybe how you could use that to your advantage in a scene. If you wanted something to look kind of really glossy, maybe an ice or a water scene, then you can do that with that specular value. Okay, so that's step one in looking at a rendering, is the materials that are in the space. And using that material paintbrush, you can paint on different materials in the space and change them up. The next thing that affects a rendering is the lighting that's in the space. Both the natural lighting that's coming in through the windows, the sunlight, and also any lights that you put into the space. You can see that I have some pot lights over the window here, and I also have some pendant lights hanging over the breakfast bar area. All of those lights are going to illuminate and give some lighting in the space. I'm going to click on this pendant light, right-click, and look at its properties so we can look at the lights that are attributed to this one pendant light. When you're looking at the properties of a light, we're going to go right to this Lights tab. This is where that fixture is going to get its lighting properties. What type of bulb, how bright it is, what color that bulb is, the direction of that light, all happens under this Lights tab. So if I go down through, you can see the brightness percentage is set to 100%. So if I wanted to dim that down, this light, I could change that brightness percentage. When I'm looking at the light type, we can see we've set it to a 60-watt incandescent chandelier light. By clicking Edit here to the right of that light source, that 60-watt bulb, it'll take me into a catalog of all different types of light sources. This will allow you to change it to be just maybe a 13-watt bulb or a 100-watt bulb. So you can see the different effects that lighting is going to have. Each one of these light sources, if I right-click and edit the light itself, has properties behind it. So you can see that this light itself is going to have kind of an orangey warm glow. If I click on that color, it'll bring me into a color palette. So if I wanted to change up that lighting color and maybe make it more of a harsh white so I can see the clear color coming through, I can do that. And if I wanted to make sure that it can cast a shadow, this light, I want to make sure that it is checked there as well. Okay, so lots of different options for the lighting itself. If you've ever worked with maybe higher end things like Studio Max, where you have lots of different options for lighting, that's all the different background lighting options you have here if you want to play with them. So you can change the wattage of the light, the color of the light, and the percentage of the brightness here with the light itself. So when you do a rendering, if you find that, whoa, that light is way too intense, it's really bright, it's making everything look like it's burning because it's got that bright light on it, you might want to come in here and look at the settings of that light and maybe back off the light source or the brightness of that light itself. Another factor that can play an effect on that is the light's position. I'm going to draw your eye over here to the little diagram of the light. So here's our 3D light. This is the fixture that we're going to insert. Notice the red kind of a puck look underneath it. That red puck represents where the light bulb itself is sitting if it was starting to illuminate light. You're not going to see that red puck. You can see out here in our scene, we don't see the red puck. But when it starts to emit light, it's coming from that red puck. The reason I've dropped this red puck below the actual light fixture, because if the light itself was sitting up inside the actual fixture, the light would bounce around inside that fixture and it wouldn't be bright enough and it wouldn't illuminate nicely. So when I drop it down, I know it's not going to get lost inside the fixture. It's sitting below it and it can illuminate nicely. And that's the value over here. You can see we've got this Z value that I've set to -2 feet. So from the top of the fixture, I've dropped it down 2 feet, 1 3/4 of an inch to sit below the fixture. You can come in here and type any value that you want. So if you want to raise that up, so if I change this to just 2 feet and lost the 1 inch, it'll move that value up. So we'll be able to see that light going up and down. So you can see how that slightly moved up there when I changed it to just 2 feet. The other option that we have for the light is the orientation of the light. So the light is sitting there below the fixture, but where is the light beams directed? And this allows us to give a little bit of direction to that light. So if we wanted to make sure that the light was shining on something, so think of a light sitting above a piece of artwork, and we wanted that light to shine very purposely on that artwork. This is where we can tilt it up and down and tilt it left and right. So if I change this light to be degrees, and if I said here that I want it to be 45 degrees, when this light coming from this particular fixture is lighting down, it's going to be on a 45-degree angle, okay, coming from that light. So it will allow me to very purposely direct that light towards something. You can also use that to your advantage if you find that the light coming straight down is hitting something that you don't want it to hit. Tilt that light. Get it out of the direction. You still want the light, but you don't want it to be coming harshly straight down. Give it a slight little tilt, and then that'll affect the light as well. Okay, so those are all the options on individual lights that you have. Turn down the brightness, change the wattage and color, and where the light is coming from, that position from the actual fixture itself. If I find that I want to show the fixtures in the space, but I don't want them turned on, perhaps I want to do an evening setting where I only want one of the lights on, not all of the lights on, you can turn on and off individual lights. So if I select a light and right click, you can see I've got light on, light off. And if I turn that light off, you can see that it's no longer illuminating. But when I right click and say light on again, then you can see that it's illuminating from that light itself. So use that to your advantage as well. You want to see the fixture, but you don't want to see the light coming from it. Just turn the light off. And then in the rendering itself, it will be disregarded and you won't see that light shining in the space itself. The other factor of the light is the light in the scene itself that's coming naturally through the windows. I'm going to right-click in the scene itself. I don't have anything selected, but by right-clicking right in my space, I get options. And one of the options that I see is scene properties. So when it's looking at this scene itself, what are the properties that are behind it? The catalog panel that's normally to the right is now updated with scene properties. When we're looking at scene properties, it's dealing with what date is it, what time of year is it, what time of day is it, so it can cast down the correct shades and shadows for that time of year and that time of day. So you'll notice that I've got my date and time here set to October. I use October because the sun is a little lower in those late months of the year, so it can cast in the windows a lot nicer. So if you really want to see some shades and shadows. So if you look on this wall, you can see the shadows coming in and the light coming in this window. And I just took advantage of the fact that it's October, it's a lower sun, and I set it to 4 o'clock. If I play with that time and tell it that it's now maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon, see how the light disappears and I don't see all of the shades and shadows, but outside I begin to see those shades and shadows. So play with the time of day and the time of year so that you can see the shades and shadows that you want to see in a space. This is particularly effective if you have a room with a lot of windows and you want to profile to your client, what is this going to look like at noon, at 2 o'clock, at 6 o'clock in the afternoon in this space, so they get a really good understanding of what light is going to be in that room. Is it going to be too much light? Do they want to maybe scale back on how many windows are there? Or do they want maybe a bigger overhang on the roof itself? So play with these values, time of day and time of year, so you can affect the amount of light naturally coming in the windows and what windows. So if I, again, change that time of day, I could have light coming through on the opposite side of the house. So I could see the effects of it as well. You'll also notice down near the bottom of the scene properties that it has sun and sky. So these are the sky settings. It's a partly cloudy sky day or it's a clear sky. So when the sun in the scene is shining down, it's going to be filtered through and it's not going to be quite as bright if it's a partly cloudy day versus a clear sky. That's how exact you can get with the software on how it's dealing with those various settings. Play with them. Do a rendering 4 o'clock, do a rendering at 1 o'clock, do a rendering in May, in October, so you can see the effects of the different shadows in a room itself as well. And again, to get to those scene properties, all I did was when I'm in a 3D scene, either outside or inside a house, without anything selected in my space, and to deselect everything, you can just click on this little arrow in the upper left-hand corner under the building tab, and that'll deselect everything. And then you can right-click in the space. And when you right-click in the space, then you'll see the scene properties. And then you can go over and change the date and the time and the background. You'll see with this particular scene, I'm just using a 2D image. But with version 13, we introduced the 3D skyboxes. So you could change that to your 3D image and have a 3D image behind it as well. So that when you're looking out each window, it's going to be a different scene. With 2D images, it's the same scene that's just going and plastered around like a square all the way around your building. With a 3D skybox, it's a scene that's globally built around the building, so it's always a different scene looking at the various windows, so it's a more realistic scene as well. Okay, so those are all of the 2 different things that are going to affect a rendering. The lights you have in the space, natural, and the lights you insert into a space, and the materials itself. Because if we have a specular surface right underneath this light source, it's going to be glossy and it's going to be reflective. So we're going to start seeing some reflection in the scene as well based on the materials that are there. Once you're happy with the way the sun is casting in and you can see that in your space and the lights that you have there in the materials, then it's time to go up to the View pull-down menu and choose Render 3D Real View. And when we're in the Render 3D Real View dialog box, there's a number of different options in here as well that kind of have an effect on your finished rendering. So I want to go through them as well so you have a good handle on what they do. Down in the lower left corner of this dialog box, you'll see an options button. I'm going to click on the options, and that brings up our 3D Real View settings. In here at the very top, you can see that there's different levels of rendering, level 1 to level 5. And beside each one, you'll see that it's the lowest level to the highest level, the fastest, the slowest. Take advantage of these different levels depending on how much time you have. So if you're quick going out to meet a client, you have to get out the door very quickly, do a low-level rendering. It'll cast basic shades and shadows, and you'll be able to get something that looks better than just a screenshot. But if you have the time, let it work itself up to this level 5, the highest rendering. The difference between low level and high level is the amount of light that is illuminating both from the sun and from the light sources itself. Level 5 is going to have more realistic light beams coming down from those light sources so that they can reflect and refract off of all of the various materials to give it a more realistic look. Level 1 is just bringing down a few, it's just doing it as quick as it can, and it's not going to have that high level look of the rendering to it. But you can see level 5 is the slowest. With that added information from every light source, it's going to take time to do that. It's got to look at every beam of light that's coming down, how it's hitting that material that it's hitting, and when it hits that material, if it's one of those materials that you've got a specular value to it, how is that creating that specular look? And if it's creating that reflection, what is it reflecting on? So every material has to be looked at. So it takes longer. What also affects the speed of a rendering is the amount of information in the model itself. So if you have, just as I have in this model, one room, it's going to go quickly, even if it's at a level 5, because there's not a lot of extra information in this model. It's one room. It's this kitchen. We're looking at the cabinets. There's a couple pictures on the wall. It just has to look at those various materials and it's done. Whereas if you're working on a 10,000 square foot home, it has to potentially look through every single wall in that model, in every room. Even though we're just doing the kitchen maybe in that room, materials in another room could be emissive, could be reflective, and reflect into the space. So it has to take those into account. So the bigger the model, the longer it's going to take. So if I'm working on a particularly large model and I know I want to get a rendering of just the kitchen and I have a timeline and I want to get it out quickly, I'll do a file, save as, and I'll call it Jones Project Kitchen Render. And then I open up the Jones Project Kitchen Render that I've saved. It's a copy of the 10,000 square foot model. And in that copy of the larger model, I got it. If there's a second floor, it's gone. Every extra room that's not going to bring in any extra lighting into my kitchen is gone. So I seal up the walls all the way around that one room so that I'm just rendering that one room. The model size diminishes quite significantly because you're just dealing with one room, not an entire model. So it's going to go quicker. Okay, so the size of the model and the amount of elements that you have in the space are going to affect the room itself. Even in this small one room, I could be looking at hours and hours of rendering if I fill it full of different things in that space. So if I've got lots of furniture in the space and different materials all over every different wall and different, beams and everything going on, if there's a lot of stuff in the room, again, it's going to take longer. But sometimes that stuff is that magic in the room that you need to keep. You want to show those exposed beams. So keep them, absolutely keep them, but just know it's going to take you a little bit longer to render that space than just a square box. Okay, so when you get the opportunity, do a high level rendering. I always start off when I'm doing a rendering at a lower level, maybe about a 3, just so I can get a feel of what that rendering is going to look like before I commit to that high level rendering that's going to take longer. So when I do a level 3 rendering, I can see shades and shadows being cast accurately, not as nicely as level 5, but I can see them casting down. So if I see that, I've got that grandfather clock in that one space and it's casting a really bad shadow into my kitchen, No one's going to understand that shadow. They can't really see the clock in the space, but they see the shadow from it. I'll just take it out of the space. So it allows me to look through the space, make sure there's nothing going on that I think looks poor in the space itself. And then once I'm happy with how everything's rendering, then I commit to that high level. Down below that, we have what we call anti-aliasing. When we're looking at straight lines in a computer image, video cards often, and this is more, it's getting better and better every day as technology gets better, has a degree of difficulty displaying a straight line. So if you notice when you go to do your renderings that the edges are really jagged, they look like they're jagged along the edges, you want to pump up this anti-aliasing value, and we can have it as high as 5. When I commit to a level 5 rendering, I also commit to an anti-aliasing of 5, just so I know I've got it, the computer working with me as much as it can to make sure that everything is nice and smooth and all the lines look realistic in the scene. Down below that, we deal with environmental settings. So when we have electrical lights and natural lights coming into a space, at some point, those two different light sources are going to merge into each other. And when they do that, they can give it kind of a dusty look. So if you've ever created a rendering and thought it kind of looks specular, kind of dusty up in that corner of the space, or the walls kind of have that specular kind of dusty look to them, that's where the lightings are merging together and it's showing you where that's happening. So what we can do here is pump up the value of this noise reduction for the electrical lights. So when they do hit the natural lighting in a space, it's not going to show you that dusty appearance with it. So you can bump up the value of the noise reduction for electrical lights, and you can also do that for skylights as well, because they're going to be a natural light source coming down through as well. So where they hit, you're going to want to make sure that they don't leave that dusting with any other light sources that are coming in through the windows too, so that can be increased. Play with those values, and then you'll see the effects that they have. Do a rendering, and you might see that dusty look I'm talking about and think, aha, now I know what she means. I'm going to change that noise reduction for my electrical lights and my skylight to counterbalance that to give it more of a clean look again. When you're bringing in 2D images to your space, like a tree or a billboard, those elements, because they're just a 2D flat image, we have to tell it how intense we want them to look in that 3D scene that we're creating. So the tree and billboard intensity can be set to a percentage. We set it as a default to 35, and that will work for most renderings. But if you find that when you're bringing in a 2D image, like a billboard of people or billboard of a dog we've brought in before, and it looks too fake, you can play with this tree and billboard intensity to either bring it up or down the value. But 35% seems to be works well for most renderings, so that's the default setting that we have there. So those are all the different ray trace quality values that you can have and set to create a rendering. We looked at before the model, the lighting, the materials, and now we're looking at the settings that go into it. So when I hit Start Render, it looks at all of those different settings that I set. I said I wanted a high level, level 5 rendering. It looks at the materials that are in my space. It looks at the lighting that's in the space, and starts to do its calculation of illumination, the lighting in the space. And as it goes through those calculations, you can see that it starts to do different passes of the light. Here's the light from the windows. Here's the light from the different light sources, and it's going through. And it's going through its ray tracing process of bringing down the individual rays of light from each light source and what they're going to look like in that scene. And as it does that, you'll see that you'll get an elapsed time and the estimated time for it to complete that rendering in that scene. If you're wondering what kind of computer I'm working on a laptop with an NVIDIA video card. The laptop itself is about 3 years old. So it's not a powerhouse machine that I'm working on today for this, but I just want to be able to show you the steps. as it's ray tracing and going through the scene to create this scene, I can also play with these three values down here: brightness, burn, and gamma. So when I'm looking at brightness, if I find that there's just not enough light in this space, I've got the lights coming in, I like how they're shining, I like how the light's coming in through the window, but the scene seems a little dark for my taste. I can bring up this brightness, and as I do, watch the image, and you'll see that it just gets brighter and brighter. You might also find that the scene looks too bright. There's so many light sources coming into that space that it looks so bright that you can bring that down. I'm going to draw your attention over here as well, and maybe I'll just draw a line around it, a pen around it. See that dusting right there? That little specular? That's what I'm meaning for when we can adjust those values in our options. So we can look at changing the electrical lights, and if there was a skylight, and changing that and bringing up that value. That little dusting can be eliminated completely if I bring up that value. Okay. If I find that there's burn happening around the lights, I can change the burn and the gamma of the lights themselves to give it a more natural looking appearance too. Okay, so those are all different options that you have. When you complete your rendering, you can save it. You can also convert it to a grayscale. So if you wanted to create a rendering so they can see the room, but you know that you have a client that's not ready to commit to materials, and if you show them a rendering with materials, their mind will instantly go to, I hate that countertop, to instead of the fact of, I like the layout of the space. So if you're dealing with, I like the layout of the space, I want to show you how the light's going to filter into the room, you might want to do a grayscale. So it gives that rendered look, but in a black and white. Without the grayscale, then you get the materials. So if they're ready to commit to actual materials, you might want to show them the materials. And when you save it, you can save it as a JPEG or a bitmap. When you save it as a JPEG, that's great for sending by email or putting up onto a website because a JPEG is a smaller file size. If you're going to actually print this out, you're going to want to save it as a bitmap. A bitmap, when it goes to create the bitmap, it takes all the pixels of color. So think of this room that you see on the screen as individual little tiny dots of color. When it creates it as a bitmap, bitmaps create the dots nice and close together, so it looks really nice when you go to print it out. JPEGs are farther apart in those little dots, so that it's a looser file and it's a smaller file size, so it can load quicker on websites. Your eye really doesn't see the difference on a website to say that, oh, that's a JPEG, that's a bitmap. But when you print them out, when you see a really nice image that's been printed, it's a bitmap. Those little pixels of color are nice and close together. Okay, so I'm just going to close this out, and that's dealing with rendering. What I want to deal with next is, well, what if I want to bring someone into my office or send somebody away with more of a VR experience? I don't want to show them just the image. I want to bring them in and immerse them in a VR environment. Working over the internet, obviously I can't immerse you in this scene. You'd need to have your Oculus helmets on or your HTC Vive helmets on and be connected to my computer. But what I will show you is how to get there in the scene. So when we're here in a 3D model, you have to be in a 3D model to go to a VR scene. You come up to the View pull-down menu. And when you go to the View pull-down menu, you would go to Presentation mode. And when you're in Presentation mode, it takes over your scene to show you just that room. And at the very bottom, you'll get some options for, the first one's going to be VR goggles. And when you click on that little icon that looks like VR goggles, it takes you into VR mode. It's as simple as that. There's nothing else that you have to worry about doing when you go into that scene. So go up to View, Presentation mode, and then you'll notice at the bottom of the screen, you'll see VR goggles, a little icon that looks like that. Click on it, and you're in VR mode. You'll be able to navigate around with your VR controller that you have with either your Oculus Rift or your HTC Vive. Both of them come with navigating controls if you buy those units. And then you'll be able to navigate through the scene. And then when you're done, there's a little icon at the bottom that's an X, and you can get out of that VR scene. And then when you're out of the VR scene, that's when you can come in here, make changes to colors and move furniture around as you need to, and then just go back into presentation mode to create it. If you want to send your client away with something so they remember what they saw when they were in your office, you can also take these scenes and export them out as a panoramic view. And when you export a panoramic view, you can send a link from that panoramic view to their smartphone so that they can pull it up on their own smartphone if they have the Envisioneer VR app. When you click on Export Panoramic View, and it's telling me right now in my scene properties I have a 2D image, not a 3D cube, and so it's going to tell me that my background is going to be blank, and that's just fine for today. When we go in there, you'll see that it goes through that same kind of dialog box that we were in when we were rendering. What it has to do is step through the lighting in the room, and it has to create image shots of the space itself. Because when you're in a panoramic 3D image, it's not just looking at this one scene, but it's also taking shots behind you and to either side of you so that you can pan around inside the entire room. And you'll be able to pan around that entire room right on your own smartphone. So when this gets generated, we'll have the option to export that to our phone. When we do that, I'm just going to turn that off for now. I want to bring you up to our website where I have loaded on our gallery different images. The images at the top are interior renderings. So these are images that were created in Envisioneer. There's no extra work that was done in any other software. This is a direct rendering coming out of Envisioneer, where they looked at the materials on the floor. See, it's got that slight specular value to it. It's not overwhelming. It's just nice and reflective. And you've got the dull finish on the cabinet. So they set that specular value right down to 0. And you can see the reflective value on the stainless steel as well, slightly specular on those. So there's different renderings that you can look through in the gallery on our website so that you can see the type of rendering quality that you're going to be able to achieve. Also up here in our gallery, what we've just added, if you scroll down to the bottom, we get a lot of questions about, well, what does a panoramic view on my phone going to look like before I load that app onto my phone? So we've loaded a few up onto our website here. So this is one of the images that we have created in that panoramic view option, export option out of Envisioneer. So this model was created in Envisioneer, and then they exported it out as a panoramic, and this type of image can be set to your smartphone. To navigate around on your smartphone, you just use your finger and just pull in the direction that you want to look, up, down, all the way around. So when it's exporting out that image, it's not like a rendering process that's looking in one direction and only there and creating a flat 2D image. It's actually taking lots of different renderings and piecing them together to create this panable view that you can send to their smartphone. It's a really great way to share projects with your clients. We've got a lot of great feedback from this that they've been able to export out and send it up to the phones. The clients have downloaded it and got very excited about their space because they can visualize it and share it with their friends and show their friends what their new room is going to look like. So if you go up to our gallery, and you can see the address up here at the top of the screen, there's lots of different panoramics that are here, and these are the same ones that are in our Envisioneer VR app that's up on our website, on your Google Play Store or the Apple Store. If you install the Envisioneer VR app, these are the samples that you're going to be able to see on your phone. And if you use in Envisioneer the file export panoramic view, you're going to be able to export views just like those up onto your phone, and then you'll be able to send links to your clients so that they'll be able to immerse themselves in their space. It's a great way for them to see all the way around and pan around a view if they don't want to see just a 2D image. Lots of information covered today. I'm going to be just kind of reiterating everything I said so we can go through all the different settings. But now would be a good time, if you do have any questions, to start typing them up so we can take advantage of the question and answer period at the end of this webinar. But let me just kind of recap over everything that we did cover today. When we're creating a rendering or even a VR scene that we're going to be sending up to the Envisioneer VR app, we have to be mindful of the lights that are in the space and the materials that are in the space. Every light, if we left click on it and then right click and look at their properties, have settings behind it on how that particular fixture is going to emit light. So if I go to the Lights tab, it will show me the type of light, the brightness that I have. Think of a dimmer. You can dim that down. Where the light is sitting in relation to the fixture, and if it's going to be tilted or not. These lights, if I click on Edit over here, I can change the wattage. So if I'm not happy with how bright a light is or the direction of that light, I can change all of that. I can select a different light. I can change the tilt. If I find there's too many lights in my space, I want to be able to see the fixtures, but I don't want all of the light. It's way too bright and way too overwhelming. You can right-click on a light and turn the light on or off. And when the light's off, you can see that it no longer emits the light, and I can turn it back on, and the light turns back on. All the different lights in the space affect the overall outcome of the panoramic views and the renderings you produce. So not only think of the light fixtures in the space, but think of the sunlight. If I right-click in my space, I can go to the scene properties. The scene properties will be shown on the right-hand side of my screen where we normally see the catalog panel. And in there, I can play with the time of day and also the time of year that I'm in. So if I want to see what the sunlight is going to look like in a space at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in April, I can change the date and time so I can get an accurate shades and shadows coming into that space. Once we've dealt with the lighting, then we look at the materials. So I'm going to click on this material paintbrush to bring up all of the different materials that are available. And if I want to look at the properties of a particular material, I can look at this material eyedropper. And when I click on the eyedropper, it'll highlight that material in my list, and then I can right-click on it and look at that material, bring up all of its properties. When we're looking at renderings and we're looking at panoramic views and the realism of an actual texture, we want to look at the very bottom of the dialog box and make sure we set specular emissive transparency. Think glossy, think emit light, think if I can see through it or not. Again, when we're looking at specular, don't set anything above 15%. Do if you want to do a trial to see what it looks like. But when you have things that are over 15%, it really starts to give that liquidy look. So if you want it to have more of a liquid look, maybe it's a water scene, maybe you want to show some ice, you can bump that up. But don't have everything in the room too glossy or it tends to look too unrealistic. Take advantage of emissive on your fireplaces, on your lampshades, so they look like they're glowing. Okay, so those have an effect. The last thing that has effect on your renderings is the actual settings that are found under Render 3D Real View. When we're looking at all the different renderings in here under options, remember there's different levels that we can have, anti-aliasing, noise reduction, so that we're keeping and creating a rendering that's very realistic. when we're looking at rendering and we're tight for time and we want to create it, one thing that really affects a rendering is the file size that you're dealing with. So if you have a large model, big square footage, lots of items into it, lots of furniture placed into it, just realize it's going to take more time to do that rendering than a small square box. So if you're in a hurry, make a copy of your model, save it as a new file name, and then you can play with that one extra copy of your model to eliminate everything you don't need so that it goes a little quicker for you to create that rendering. When you do start the rendering, remember that you can play with brightness, burn, and gamma so that you can brighten up the space as it's rendering, and you can play with those values as it's creating the rendering itself. When you want to bring someone into that immersive VR experience and you have a Oculus Rift or an HTC Vive unit attached to your computer, then you can go into presentation mode. And when you're in presentation mode, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little icon that looks like a VR headset. If you click on that, you're taken into a VR environment instantly. There's no more different work that you have to do. You don't have to export it. It happens right inside the Envisioneer environment. So you can navigate around the space and look up and around with the helmet on to feel like you're actually in the space. It's a really great way for people that have a hard time visualizing a space to feel what it would be like to be in that space. It's very immersive. It's a great way to view a room. When you get out of that VR mode, you can start making changes and go back into it at any time. If you want to send your client away with a little reminder of what their space looks like, you can export it as a panoramic view. In the booklet that I'm sending you at the end of today's webinar, I've included instructions of all the different settings for renderings, for the panoramic views, for lighting, and for the materials. So you can read about all the different settings I covered today. I know there's so many of them. So look over the document that I'm sending you so you can create those panoramic views and send them up to your phone. What I'd like to do now is concentrate on your questions that you might have about rendering and VR. On the GoToMeeting console to the right of your screen, if you expand it out, you'll notice that there's a chat portion. Type in any questions that you might have, and I'll be able to answer them. I always say every webinar I do, never hesitate to put up your hand and ask a question. I'm the only one that can see them. And I truly believe that every question you post up there is a great question, because if you feel like, oh, I don't know, people might think this is a silly question, everybody's thinking the same thing. Everybody will have the same question, and they'll appreciate the fact that you posted it for them to learn. That's what these Tuesday webinars are all about, learning the software so you can take advantage of all the various features and use it productively in your business. So let's get to your questions so I can answer them for you. Okay. As a user, can I create a skybox? Yes, skybox can be created. They're a little more difficult. You have to piece them together. But even if you do a Google search on creating a skybox, it's not something that is just in Envisioneer. Lots of different technology, even gaming technology, uses skyboxes. So if you do a Google search on creating skyboxes, you can put together a skybox. There are different skyboxes available in Envisioneer so that you can take advantage of the ones we've created for you. You can also do a Google search on skyboxes, and you'll be able to bring those skyboxes in as well. Are the requirements for Oculus Rift the same as Envisioneer? When you're going to be using Oculus Rift with Envisioneer, there is more of a computer requirement. Oculus really draws on your computer power. So I'm just going to bring up on our website the specs for the Oculus Rift. If you're wondering where you can find that, there is a couple of places on our website where you can do it. One, if you look under the Learning Center, under there, if you do just a search on requirements, you'll be able to find it. The other one is just by going to our free trial download page. We post it there so everybody's got a good handle on what type of computer you're going to need, A, to run Envisioneer, and 2, if you want to do Oculus. So if you just scroll to the bottom of this page, you'll see the Microsoft Windows and Mac requirements, and then underneath that, you'll see additional VR requirements. So if you're running the HTC Vive or you're running the Oculus Rift, there's going to be some more computer power that's needed. One, it really needs a high-end graphics card. So we have put down 2 cards that you can use as the basis for what your minimum card should be. But if you have anything less than those cards, you're not going to be able to run and use an HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift in any application. The other thing that you're going to need is the amount of RAM you'll see is significantly higher, and the USB ports. You'll need a 2.0 USB port if you're using the HTC Vive, and the Oculus Rift actually needs 2 of those 3.0 ports. It needs 3 2.0 ports, so you'll have to make sure that you have those installed. Okay, so great question. Yes, there are some significant differences in what running Envisioneer and running Envisioneer with an Oculus or an HTC Vive headset. You can find those all on our website. Okay, next question. That seems to be the only 2 questions that I had today. So I'm going to keep the chat panel open for a few more minutes, just in case someone is madly typing out something right now. I'll be able to answer those for you. But as I mentioned, after we're done today's webinar, I'm going to send you out a booklet. And in that booklet, we cover material settings, we cover lighting settings, rendering settings, how to create a panoramic view, where to find the Envisioneer VR app on your smartphone so that you can create them yourself as well. So if there isn't any further questions, we are going to end off the webinar, and I will send you that booklet. And I'll just give it just a couple more seconds here, just in case somebody has a question, or we'll end off the webinar. So I hope everybody enjoyed today's webinar. I hope you learned a little bit about rendering, how to create a really good rendering and be in the VR immersive environments in the software that are available now as well. And again, if you ever have any questions, never hesitate to reach out to our technical support team, and they'll be able to answer your direct questions as well. So thanks everyone for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope you have a fabulous week. Thanks again. Bye-bye.